Welcome to Village Voices, a series of talks by and for Rosevilla residents. Today's talk is a handy guide to Portland's radical history, sights, images, and walking tours by Michael Munk.
I'm here today to talk about the history of radical Portland, as I've tried to present in my Portland Red Guide. When I retired from my working life back east and came back to Portland, where I came of age, I guess you could call it, in high school and college, for the first time in my life, I chose where I was going to live and how I was going to spend my time. So basically, I spent my time originally researching the history of the city in which I was going to spend the rest of my life, focusing on its radical past. When I returned to Portland, one of the first things that I noticed was it presents itself as a city to people who live here and people who visit in the names of its streets, its buildings, and its monuments. And I immediately noticed that they were named for the winners in the economic competition that our economic system requires. They were the people who exploited natural resources, who took the land from the Native Americans who lived here before, the people who exploited workers in the factories. And missing was the other side of that competition. Those who lost, but those who believed or committed themselves to a better world rather than their personal position in it. In other words, they opposed those who the city now honors as its pioneers, as its entrepreneurs, and those who are considered success in the mainstream narrative. So I decided to dedicate my time to presenting that other side, those who struggled on behalf of the exploited, on behalf of people removed from their lands, and so on. My efforts resulted in a guidebook, and I chose it deliberately, that format, in order to, I hope, produce the same kind of curiosity from the physical space that people are witnessing, the same kind of response that patriotic sites like Mount Rushmore are intended to inspire in the people. So the guidebook is actually a series of physical locations that are associated with the people, the organizations, and the events that mark important parts of Portland's radical history. I'd like to begin by focusing our attention on sites that are nearby Rosevilla. We, of course, live in an area that was originally inhabited by another country, the Native Americans, and white settlers were foreigners who came and took away that land. It was not the easy process that mainstream history traditionally has described it as, but actually a very brutal, violent overthrow of the existing population. And here in nearby Rosevilla, we had one of the important events of that conflict when in Oregon City on Main Street, before about 1,000 spectators, Sheriff Joseph Meek hanged 5 Cayuse Indian resistors, the leaders of a resistance against the settlers' takeover. Also in Oregon City, we had a class warfare when the paper workers at the Westland paper mill fought against strikebreakers in 1907 on Main Street again in Oregon City. We also historically have a link to utopian communities, which I guess the current term is intentional communities, but they were founded by people who were uncomfortable with industrialization and urbanization. And they decided to found what were called colonies, utopian colonies. The nearest one to Roseville is about 20 miles south at Aurora, which is now a town well integrated into the market economy. We also have, not too far away in Polk County, near Mill City, the colony of Socialist Valley. And there's an interesting aspect to Socialist Valley in the sense that the only official road sign in the United States that has the word socialist in it is Socialist Valley Road. And you can see it about 35 miles from Roseville. If you've ever been to the Oregon coast and are familiar with the towns there, it may be that you haven't known that a post office on the Oregon coast between 1904 and 1907 was called Karl Marx, and that town now is today's Nescowan. So nearby Roseville, in our neighborhoods of Selwood and Oregon City, we also look at the Oregon Yacht Club, which is just off of Oaks Park. The Yacht Club was the first home of one of the partners in that notorious duo of John Reed and Louise Bryant, who reported on the Russian Revolution and were featured in the movie Reds, where John Reed was played by Warren Beatty and Louise Bryant by Diane Keaton. So in 1909, Louise Bryant lived on a houseboat in what is still today the Oregon Yacht Club. And until she left Portland in 1915 for New York and the partnership with John Reed, her studio was in a building directly across from the public library that still exists at 1033 Southwest Yamhill. Also in Selwood was the farm from which the anarchist newspaper, the Firebrand, was published between 1895 and 1897 until it was suppressed on the charges of obscenity by the U.S. Post Office. There was also a strike at the Oregon City Woolen Mills in 1907 that's the subject of a much more recent play that was put on by the Northwest Labor College the 1970s. Still in Selwood, at the existing intersection of Southeast Tacoma and the railroad tracks, was the site of a suicide by a prominent wobbly or Industrial Workers of the World member Angus Thelsha Fair, and she killed herself by standing in front of the Oregon City train at that intersection. Finally, in our neighborhood on McLaughlin Boulevard in Milwaukee, Dr. Ruth Barnett, an abortion provider, was finally stopped from continuing her career when the Clackamas County courts found her guilty of manslaughter and sentenced her to the penitentiary. Now, all told, there were 194 locations. There are 194 sites of Portland radical history in the book. And obviously we can't describe even a small part of them, so I'll try to focus on areas, neighborhoods of the city with the largest concentration. And the one that arises first is Skid Row, which is West Burnside Street. It's an area that attracted seasonal workers in the off-season from the lumber, from mining, from fishing industries. When they were off work for seasonal reasons, they needed entertainment, they needed a place to stay, so a large number of bars and hotels developed in the area, and of course radicals followed them. So the headquarters of the IWW was at 2nd and Burnside for many, many years, and it was also the site that one of its members, Joe Hill, first sang what became famous as the Pie in the Sky song. That was in 1910. Across the street from the Wobbly headquarters was Tom Burns' Clock Shop, which had a radical library in the basement, and many Portland radicals developed their ideology and worldview by visiting that library. The intersection of 2nd and 3rd and Burnside were also the sites of the 1932 Bonus March, beginning in Portland and ending up in Washington, D.C., and also a frequent site of strikers in the 1934 Longshore Strike, which is probably the most prominent labor history event in the city. And also in the Burnside area, in 1942, Minoru Yasui was arrested for defying the curfew on Japanese Americans and sent to prison. Another major site of places listed in the Red Guide were the park blocks, the plaza blocks as they were called then, in front of the City Hall and County Courthouse, and of course today the site of the notorious demonstrations against police racism and the president's special troops in front of what is the U.S. courthouse now. Anyway, those park blocks were the favorite site of Wobbly and Socialist Party and later on the Communist Party for mass rallies and assemblies and protests, marches intended to demonstrate that there was an alternative to the way things were. Specifically, in 1934, the radicals raised a red flag over City Hall, which attracted a great deal of public attention, and of course that was its purpose. So I thought also it might be appropriate to focus on a few areas and events and organizations that led the early struggles against racism, against fascism, and for the working class. And it may come as no surprise, or it may, but wait for it. Those actions were very often led by the local Communist Party. In the early 1930s, the Communists organized a movement to save the life of a black man, Ted Jordan, who was convicted of murder in a tinged and prejudiced trial. They were also active in the protests against other police shootings of black people in Giles Lake and Vanport in 1945. The Communists were also the organizers of the efforts to help or the Vanport flood, of whom many were black. Finally, the West Side Club of the Communist Party held demonstrations to persuade Safeway in Northwest Portland to hire black workers in 1948. And the Albina Club of the Communist Party, which was composed primarily of black people, endorsed the Progressive Party's campaign for president in 1948 under Henry Wallace, and one of its members, Eustace Curry, was the first black candidate to actually win a Democratic ballot place in the primary for state legislature for Multnomah County. Communists were also the leaders of what small protests occurred when the Nazi battleship Bremen came to Portland in 1937. It was welcomed by Portland City municipal and business leaders, while at the same time the Communists even launched small boats with protest signs. Many were arrested for their premature anti-fascism. They also organized a protest against the shipping of scrap metal to Japan in the years before World War II. And finally, there were 11 Oregonians who went to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War against Franco's fascists on behalf of the Spanish Republic. And one of them, William Miller, was killed in one of the last battles of the Lincoln Brigade. He came from a farm near Dayton and joined the Communist Party in Portland. Finally, in the labor area, communists and old wobblies, sometimes the same person, by the way, were active in the Longshore Union during the great 1934 strike. And the union that emerged from it, the ILWU, commemorates Bloody Wednesday at Terminal 4, probably the bloodiest event in Portland labor history, when Portland police shot and wounded 4 strikers while trying to break the picket lines at Terminal 4 in St. John's. The leader of the ILWU in subsequent years, Francis Murnane, was the only Portland or Oregon labor leader officially honored with a public monument. And this happened after his death in 1968, and a rather elaborate monument was built just south of the Burnside Bridge on the Portland waterfront. It is, I think, very significant that only monument to a labor leader was torn down and demolished in 2007 to make way for the commercial Saturday market. This was an act that many of us described as municipal vandalism. And also, radicals were prominent in the organization of the International Woodworkers Union, the CIO union, the only union that had its headquarters in Portland. And that union, in 1949, was expelled from the CIO on charges of being communist dominated. So looking back on this very brief outline of the Red Guide, I want to emphasize that there are, as I keep saying, 194 separate places that are described very briefly in the book, but you are also offered walking tours and maps, and I think it's worthwhile too to think of our own protest here at Rose Villa, that for the past month or so we've been standing out on River Road to protest exactly what has been protested in the past: police racism, equal rights for all people. And in a sense, Rose Villa residents that participate in that protest are actually standing in the footsteps of the radicals that we have tried to chronicle in the Red Guide.
Michael Munk's Portland Red Guide is available in the Rose Villa Library.
You can join on this next song. It's simply "Oh, the River Calls" and "Oh, the Mighty River Calls." This is from a 22-day canoe trip down the Sheen-Drek River in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Born of the mountain and the Arctic wind, and your first part goes, "Oh, the river calls, northern lights and the glacier's kin," and your other part goes, "Oh, how the mighty river calls." The river's a treasure that you cannot buy. Let me hear you. Oh, the river calls. She's a glint in an eagle's eye. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. The river's a spirit flowing sweet and strong. Oh, the river calls. She's the way beckons me to come. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a lifeline flowing clean and true. Let me hear ya. Oh, the river calls to the heart of the land of the caribou. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. The river's a journey borne by some. Oh, the river calls. She's away, beckons me to come. Oh, how the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. The river's a promise of things to come, a ribbon of hope shining in the sun. The river is a life for the great and small. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. Oh, it's a call of the wild that the mighty river calls. We could live if we could walk this land with respect for all. Oh, what a life we could live. Oh, what a life we could live.
Nightmare and insanity are akin. Mysterious and involuntary states that skew and distort objective reality. One wakens from nightmare. From insanity, there is no awakening. Whether Americans live in the one state or the other is the paramount question of this era. For 200 years, Americans have been indoctrinated with a mythology created, imposed, and sustained by a manipulating cabal. A financial elite that built its absolute control on the muscle and blood, ignorance and credulity of its citizenry. It has now metastasized into the corporate tyranny that owns and controls America. America began with the invasion of a populated continent and the genocide of its people. Once entrenched, it embraced enslavement of another race. With those pillars of state in place, it declared itself an independent nation in a testament that proclaimed the equality of all mankind. In that monumental act of hypocrisy, America's myth had its genesis. A constitution was written that came to be regarded as Holy Writ. Designed by men of wealth and prominence, its central purposes were to defend private property and suppress mass democracy. It has fulfilled those mandates beyond the dreams of its creators. With the existing oligarchy secure in law and native people largely exterminated, the ruling class increased its wealth and power fantastically in the 19th century, using the government as its enabler, exploiting to the limit the device of chartered corporations. So empowered, the financial elite used the military to expand its sway beyond the continent. Regions, territories, islands, and whole countries were annexed, invaded, and possessed outright, their peoples crushed, suppressed, and exploited. Because ordinary Americans, like any people, need to believe that whatever the ruling class undertakes in their name must be essentially benevolent, noble in purpose, and justified in fact, the American myth had to be radically modified for imperial expansion. The foundational myth was that the Americans had come to a howling wilderness teeming with godless savages, and through invincible strength of character and purity of purpose had tamed the land and honorably earned the right to possess their bountiful home. In the era of extraterritorial expansion, that version was polished to justify and ennoble imperialism. The new corollary was that America was obliged by our manifest destiny to carry our mission into barbaric darkness wherever tyranny created abuse and suffering. A national myth that absolutely binds the loyalty of a people to its government must be a subtle and powerful elixir that elevates and aggrandizes that people's self-regard. National policy will then appear to be an extension of its superior citizenry's inchoate will and an instrument of justified arrogance toward the lesser world. The simple, powerful myth of America's heroic and altruistic benevolence, shaped by the financial elite, infused Americans with a hubristic belief in their racial superiority that mobilized gave imperialist enterprises the character of a quasi-religious crusade. In this way, insatiable imperialism acquired the apparent moral perfection of a syllogism. With World War II, the world was reconfigured. American capitalism emerged supreme from the horror that had virtually wrecked its capitalist partners. The Soviet Union, though, in spite of having absorbed much the greatest devastation of all from Nazi Germany, rose astonishingly from its ruin to become the sole rival to America as a world power. This challenge was not competitive, it was systemic. Soviet communism was a direct threat to American hegemony in that it categorically refuted the philosophical basis of predatory capitalism. Grounded in Marx and Lenin, it attacked capitalism's inherent evils, monstrous inequities, and flagrant injustices that, when exacerbated by speculation, exploitation, and fraud, would eventually destroy it. And it promoted world revolution to that end. The Cold War required further refinement of the American myth. Instead of simply intervening where circumstances supposedly demanded that we impose our system, America now had to be the shield and bulwark of the sacred capitalist system in which free enterprise, magically identified with democracy, was equally to be defended. This version held through many surrogate confrontations in the era of mutually assured destruction, and survived even the debacle of Vietnam, lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union. On radio and television, Americans were subjected to an unrelenting barrage of hyper-patriotism, in which American moral superiority was a given, and America's self-touted courage, generosity, and decency were its unchallengeable proofs. The implosion of the Soviet Union left America, in its own terms, the sole superpower in a unipolar world, which required further retooling of the myth. The practical effect of having no doomsday enemy, China wouldn't do yet, was to supercharge its element of pure hubristic ego. America was no longer just the defender of the free world from heresy. It was now, by virtue of its glorious self-touted exceptionalism, required to oversee and police it in the interests and for the benefit of all. Power tends to corrupt, said Lord Acton, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When the only rival to American power disintegrated, our ruling elite saw the opportunity, for the first time in history, for one country to absolutely dominate and control the world. This consensus was expressed in a policy statement by major hard right-wing political players titled The Project for a New American Century. This triumphalist manifesto laid out a plan for absolute American access to and control of essential resources and raw materials worldwide, guaranteed by our military enforcing full-spectrum dominance. The American myth, which had lost some momentum in the totally unexpected so-called Cold War victory, was now re-energized with a proactive essence and endowed with the glowing radiance of a true and, for the first time, self-professed imperial mission. The attack on the towers, an unimaginable provocation, was the trigger mechanism for the explosive launch of the effort to impose that imperial model in practice on the world. It has been without question the most spectacular failure in the history of American misadventure. After a decade marked by the waste of trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, the stunning bankruptcy of our internally burglarized nation, and a consequent recession more fundamentally damaging than the Great One, Imperial America has nothing to show for the astonishing folly of its arrogant overreach, but unequivocal disasters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, with no end of madness in sight. It is clear that the hypnotic hold of the American myth on the loyalty of the people has led only to disgrace and tragedy, and set a course to inevitable imperial decline and ruin. This truth, though, entirely mistakes the purpose of the myth. It was never intended to serve either our country or our people. It was created solely to shield, buttress, and exalt the financial ruling class. It has done that with complete and astonishing success. As a prime example, the massive looting of funding for the Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan wars to enrich the corporate tyranny is on a unique scale of its own, without anything remotely comparable to its flagrant obscenity in the whole long history of war. Neither the Pentagon nor the government can account for the billions of dollars that have vanished there. There is no doubt that beyond the outrageously inflated no-bid contracts given to giant corporations with their obscene guaranteed profits, much of the money was simply stolen by, through, or in spite of the military, and distributed among thieves and accomplices. Much of it came in bricks on huge pallets, for convenience, presumably. As this wholesale corporate robbery was in progress under military oversight abroad, the corporate tyranny evolved a new set of impenetrably complex devices for the generation of money without either any economically productive source or result at home. The sole driving force and purpose of capitalism is, of course, the realization of profit. According to that iron calculus, reducing production costs increases profit margin. This leads to the obvious conclusion that as production costs near zero, profit is maximized. There is no provision for social good in capitalist theory. Corporations, created to optimize commercial opportunity through efficient specialization, were originally required to operate for public good, but that provision was quickly finessed and forgotten. American law courts have always favored corporate concentrations of wealth since they, like the Congress, exist to serve moneyed interests. And the judiciary has consistently cooperated in ruling reliably for corporations and against the interests of the people. Indeed, without considering the question in law, the Supreme Court long ago endowed corporations with personhood, that is, with all the rights of human beings under our Constitution. That this travesty occurred as a slipshod clerical error shows that the court preferred to mask this perversion of the intent of the 14th Amendment as an unexamined assumption, rather than risk an eventual test which would have created public outrage. Given the collusion of Congress and the courts in securing legal invulnerability for the corporate tyranny, and the fact that corporations' only duty is maximization of profit, it was inevitable that megabanks, huge brokerage houses, giant insurance conglomerates, gilded hedge funds, and credit agencies pretending to certify their work all engaged in massive criminal fraud and deception for just that purpose. The result was the crash of '08, the recession, and the unprecedented bailout of the biggest banks and investment houses with taxpayer dollars. So much for the invisible hand of the free market. In recent years, two related trends have battered the American myth. First, any belief the world had in it has been shattered by a catastrophic series of imbecile military disasters which has eroded its efficacy at home. Second, in response, the state has made crude efforts to boost its waning power by imposing totalitarian-style surveillance, intimidation, and coercion on the American people to a degree unprecedented in scope and scale. The vast, clanking medieval apparatus of Homeland Security that has sprouted like an enormous poison fungus since 9/11, with its brutal police state mindset, the odious Patriot Act with its flagrant subversions of the Bill of Rights, the endless fantasy-based terror peddling of the prostitute corporate media with its clowns and harpies churning irrational fear and anger in the uninformed, all this grim repressive machinery is a ham-handed attempt to distract Americans from the real causes of their injury, abuse, and oppression. And yet, even with the American myth now exposed for the tissue of lies, deceptions, and frauds that it has always been, it still keeps its phenomenal hold on the great mass of American people. The sad reality is that for the majority, their own identities have been so deeply and thoroughly infused with the myth that to disbelieve it is to disbelieve in themselves. So the dead American myth lives on in its deadness, horribly masking our crapshot economy, our bankrupt debtor's prison of a society, our ghost dance charade of kabuki democracy, while typhoons of impending social, economical, and ecological disaster build their enormous, lightning-charged thunderheads above the dark future before us. And what does the dead myth still obscure? What is beyond the wall of failing deception and dishonesty? What horrors has the shoddy fable so long and effectively concealed? It is a world brutalized by the violence of our imperialist mania. It is the wrecked and pillaged economies looted by our predatory capitalist austerity regimes. It is the hundreds of millions of starved, dying children sacrificed to Wall Street commodities gaming. It is the multitudes of innocent, ignorant people barely surviving under absolutist regimes propped up by our tax dollars, while our banks siphon off profits from arming their brutal police states and bribing their kings, sheikhs, or generals. It is the millions of dead and maimed and raped populations of simple tribal people that our indiscriminately murderous juggernaut has left in its bloody wake in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It is the bitter and appalling legacy of hate and repulsion, disdain and fear which America has earned with its hegemonist villainy in every region of the world. And at home, what is it we Americans have been so complicit in hiding from ourselves, in our devotion to the perverse legend that has come to inhabit our souls like an incubus? It is millions of us with no work or hope in middle age whose jobs and homes have been devoured by the sick fraud machine of Wall Street. It is the trash, demolished weed lots of our major cities crumbling in fire-gutted ruin. It is the many cities with industries defunct and factories dismantled and shipped overseas. It is our decaying, defunded public schools, our bankrupt states and counties, our overtaxed, antiquated public transportation systems, our obsolete, dissolving infrastructure, our gigantic and irrational prisons horror, our cynical healthcare con game, and over it all, the jackboot mechanism of our police state, armed and empowered, ready for use against us all. This is where we are. The The great question now is whether we can awaken from our long nightmare and face the terrifying and exhilarating prospect of living in reality without the false props and dishonest constructs of a hoodwinked and dishonored people, or whether we have internalized the falsity to such an extent that it has become a collective insanity. In 1846, Henry David Thoreau, offended to his soul by the American invasion of Mexico, protested and went to jail. In his essay on civil disobedience, he said this of state policy: "If injustice is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine." To attempt to break the death grip of the American myth will be a titanic challenge. To even begin to rebel against the might of the national security state will require the courage to face far more than official disapproval. Imperial America will respond to even the most peaceful and orderly protest with hard police action, and the level of repression will rise with the scope and seriousness of the action undertaken. Small protests will have no effect. Organized mass demonstrations will draw the brutally motivated national security state apparatus down upon them. Americans, excepting our underclass, have no experience with violent police or military repression. Those who commit peaceful civil disobedience will swiftly find to their cost how it works. In a national security state that has eradicated all laws that prevent abuse of the public, whatever the state does is legal. To such a pass have we in America come, as a result of our long historic indoctrination and abject submission to our ruling class. To achieve any redemption for Americans, to make possible any more just, humane, and life-honoring society, will require complete abandonment of the system of predatory capitalism. It offers no prospect of reform or improvement, and we have all been witness to the absurdly corrupt idiocy of our so-called democratic process for generations. America is nearing the greatest crisis point in its history, and the terrific coming cataclysm will determine the future of our country. If we cannot rise in dominating numbers to reject the heartless, mindless, soulless machine of imperial predatory capitalism, we will be condemned to a fascistic command and control horror in which human beings are mere possessions of the state, units of production or service, and then perhaps not even that, as excess population in that brave new world may simply be eliminated. That end is not inevitable. We are not lost. We are not defeated, since to this moment we have not engaged. We have not honored our responsibility as human beings. We have not defended our humanity. We have abjured our power and let ourselves be ruled. All around the world, the rolling thunder of irresistible outrage is now heard and felt. In Egypt and Spain, Syria and Greece, Iraq and Sudan, Afghanistan and Ireland, everywhere the legitimate anger of humanity is fueling an uprising against the dead hand of predatory capitalism and its evils. And in Americans, so long trapped, encapsulated like flies in amber in a false religion of state idolatry, the anger is deep, widespread, and growing. The myth is broken and dead. It is up to those who know and care to lead. Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls." Nothing is guaranteed us. That can't matter. We cannot consider odds or outcomes. We simply cannot let the machine of injustice grind on. We must confront with calm courage a vicious tyrannical system that is destroying the earth and its life and its people. We must put our lives on the line to oppose it, and we must do it now. The nightmare machine of rapacious exploitation has overthrown decency and reason, and its bloody human treason flourishes over us. This must be ended. We must end it. Let your life be a friction to stop the machine.
Doesn't make any sense. How do you sleep at night? There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this. There is no honor in this, man. There's no honor in this shit. There is no honor in this shit.
In every corner of the world, we are being pressured by a monoculture, a global consumer monoculture. It is being pushed by our governments who have a blind idea of growth and development. That means supporting and subsidizing giant multinational corporations and banks, particularly through trade treaties, by deregulating global trade and finance. We're removing rules for Monsanto, for Walmart, for Coca-Cola, so that they can move more freely, and allowing foreign investment to come into every country. Now, all of that constitutes a breakdown of community. Unemployment, financial insecurity, impoverished governments are a consequence of this. And all the while, this global corporate economy uses more and more energy, more and more resources.
More and more, everything is being put into the hands of big corporations. In particular crops, entire markets have been taken over by corporations like Monsanto.
We are importing and exporting the same products in the global economy, creating a distance between production and consumption so that the food that people eat on a daily basis is coming from further and further away.
There is alternative. The alternative lies in reverse this process and to regain control over the territorial and the very material basis of our existence.
The resistance now to globalization will not come from the government of India or from the government of Brazil or the government of Mexico, which is in cahoots with the United States government on several issues. It will only come from local communities everywhere.
People are not taking things lying down. Either they're resisting these forms of destructive development and or they are creating their own alternative ways of human well-being.
At the bottom level, what we need to do to create change is to reconnect with the people around us, with the land around us.
It's about rebuilding our deeper connections to nature and to ourselves, and this is a structural way of doing it, localizing economic activity. The localization movement is growing. At the heart of this movement is a very broad and very powerful local food movement that is gaining momentum around the world. That is accompanied by local business alliances, local energy, decentralized renewable energy systems, local finance. You have the revival of local knowledge systems, and very importantly, local spiritual traditions that recognize and reinforce the oneness of life.
What we need is not scaling up of those solutions, but scaling out of those solutions, replication in millions of these variety of solutions, innovative solutions that are emerging. It's quite possible.
What we need to do is to actually create platforms in which these sorts of initiatives are able to get together, are able to synergize, are able to actually build those larger narratives, are able to begin to change the public discourse
We're trying to create an alliance, an international alliance for localization, because we need a united no, one giant no to a continuation of that system. And at the same time, we need to see ourselves as actually part of an enormous movement involving hundreds of millions of people that are saying many yeses to diverse ecosystems, diverse cultures, diverse identities. This is about reclaiming our right to be who we are in our different ways of being. It's about reclaiming the diversity that is life.
Why end war is a big topic for 2 minutes, but if beauty queens can do it in 30 seconds, we've got war all wrong. The primary way that war kills is not with any weapons, but by wasting about $2 trillion a year globally on wars and primarily on preparations for wars. About $30 billion a year would end starvation on Earth, another $11 billion provide the world clean water. A global investment in sustainable agriculture and green energy would begin to dent the military budget and to reduce the deaths caused by climate change. Don't get me wrong, war also kills with weapons. War rivals infectious disease as a cause of morbidity and mortality. 85 to 90% of the deaths are civilian by anyone's definition. The American Public Health Association calls militarism a public health threat. War is sporadic in human history, mostly absent from prehistory and unrecognizable in its current form from just a few centuries back. Intense conditioning is required and higher suicide rates result. There is nothing natural about war. And the first case of PTSD from war deprivation has yet to be discovered. War generates enemies rather than eliminating them. And to begin understanding that nonviolent alternatives are more effective, even against the most menacing evil, I recommend beginning with Erica Chenoweth's TED Talk. War is a top destroyer of the natural world. No other institution consumes remotely as much oil as the military. War is the basis for eliminating our civil liberties, and the only beneficiaries of dumping the weapons on local police are the weapons makers. A University of Massachusetts study makes clear that other spending and even tax cuts would create more jobs than military spending. There is no upside. As Benjamin Franklin said, there never was a good war or a bad peace.